September 1940, at the quiet engineering offices of Vickers-Armstrongs in Weybridge, England, while the Luftwaffe hammered London and the skies over Kent were filled with the roar of the Battle of Britain, one man sat in near silence, surrounded by slide rules and complex mathematical charts. Barnes Wallis was not a military officer or a strategist by trade. He was a designer of airships and bombers, a man who saw the world through the lens of physics and structural integrity. He knew that the war would not be won by simple attrition or by the bravery of pilots alone. It would be won by identifying the singular critical point of failure in the German war machine and striking it with the precision of a surgeon. Wallis turned his attention to the Ruhr Valley, the industrial powerhouse of the Third Reich. This region was the furnace of the German military, home to the massive steelworks of Krupp and the coal mines that fueled every tank, aircraft, and U-boat. To the British High Command, the Ruhr was a fortress of flak and smoke, a target too well deep to be destroyed by the inaccurate carpet bombing of the era. But Wallis saw something they did not. He looked past the smoking chimneys of Essen and the railways of Dortmund and saw the water. Every ton of steel produced in those mills required hundreds of tons of water for cooling and processing. Every city in the valley relied on hydroelectric power generated by a series of massive reservoirs. If the water stopped flowing, the heart of German industry would stop beating almost instantly. The key to this industrial nervous system lay in three massive structures: the Mohne, the Eder, and the Sorpe dams. These were not mere barriers. They were monumental feats of engineering, holding back over 300 million tons of water in the valleys above the industrial plains. Wallis realized that if these dams could be breached, the resulting disaster would be catastrophic for the German war effort. It would not just be a flood, it would be a total collapse of the infrastructure required to sustain a modern mechanized army. The coal mines would flood, the power stations would be swept away, and the cooling systems for the blast furnaces would fail. It was a strategy of industrial decapitation. However, the strategic problem was as immense as the dams themselves. The Mohne Dam was a gravity structure built of thick masonry, nearly 130 feet high and over 100 feet thick at its base. It was protected by heavy anti-aircraft batteries and, more importantly, by layers of heavy torpedo nets stretched across the water to catch any underwater attack. Conventional bombing from high altitude was out of the question. The RAF's current accuracy meant they could barely hit a city-sized target, let alone a narrow strip of masonry in a steep, foggy valley. Even a direct hit with a 2,000-pound bomb on the top of the dam would likely do little more than chip the surface. Wallis spent his nights calculating the explosive force required to move such a mass of stone. His initial findings were disheartening. He estimated that it would take a 10-ton bomb, dropped from 40,000 feet, to create a shock wave powerful enough to crack the dam's foundations. At that time, no aircraft in the world could carry such a weight, and no bomber could fly that high. The British High Command looked at these figures and saw an impossible task. To the generals and air marshals in London, Wallis was a dreamer, a civilian playing with numbers who didn't understand the realities of aerial warfare. They laughed at the notion that a single man with a slide rule could find a shortcut to victory that they had missed. But Wallis was undeterred. He understood a fundamental law of physics. Water is incompressible. If an explosion occurred directly against the face of the dam deep underwater, the water itself would act as a hammer, magnifying the force of the blast. The problem was delivery. If he could somehow bypass the torpedo nets and place a charge directly against the wall, the dam would crumble. This was the birth of a radical idea, a concept so absurd it seemed to belong to science fiction. Wallis imagined a weapon that could dance across the surface of the water, leaping over nets like a stone skipped across a pond, before sinking to detonate at the dam's roots. He was proposing a feat of precision that required perfect timing and pilot skill. To the Air Ministry, this was a toy, a dangerous distraction from serious bombing. Wallis's journey reminds us that in the darkest hours, it is often the outsider who finds the path to the impossible. The strategic problem was a wall of stone and bureaucracy, but Wallis had seen the crack. He knew that if he could find the right way to strike, The entire weight of German industry would be washed away by the water that sustained it. It is the Uring legacy of the visionary to be ridiculed before they are celebrated. In the quiet of his study, the tide was already turning, not with a roar, but with the scratching of a pencil against paper, marking a silent revolution in the art of modern warfare. November 11th, 1940. At the quiet estate of Burhill in Surrey, Barnes Wallis sat hunched over a cluttered drawing board, his eyes tracing the jagged lines of the Ruhr Valley maps. While the rest of England looked toward the skies in dread of the Luftwaffe, Wallis was looking at the earth, or more specifically, at the veins of water that kept the German industrial heart beating. He knew that the massive masonry dams of the Mohne, the Eder, and the Sorpe were the ultimate prizes. If they fell, the resulting deluge would not just drown the factories, but would paralyze the coal mines and snuff out the hydroelectric power that fueled the Nazi war machine. But these were not soft targets. They were gargantuan walls of gravity-fed stone and concrete, protected by the steep geography of the valleys and defed by thick curtains of anti-aircraft fire. Most importantly, they were shielded by deep water and heavy steel torpedo nets designed to catch any conventional underwater attack long before it could graze the dam's face. To the British High Command, these structures were practically indestructible. To Wallis, they were simply a physics problem, waiting for a radical solution. The breakthrough did not emerge from a military manual, but from the simple, rhythmic physics of a child's game. Wallis began to obsess over the mechanics of skipping stones across a pond. He calculated that if a projectile could be made to skip over the surface of the water, it would bypass the torpedo nets entirely, hopping over them like a hurdler clearing a fence. If the speed and the angle were precise, the bomb would bounce repeatedly, lose momentum just as it reached the dam, and then come to a gentle rest against the wall itself. From there, it would sink down the face of the masonry. Wallis realized that an explosion at the surface would merely dissipate into the air, but an explosion at a specific depth, pressed against the concrete, would use the water itself as a weapon. Because water is incompressible, the force of the blast would be channeled directly into the dam, acting like a massive hydraulic hammer that would shatter the structure from the inside out. When Wallis first presented this idea to the Ministry of Aircraft Production, the response was not one of awe, but of ridicule. They called it Wallis's silly idea. The bureaucrats and generals, steeped in traditional ballistics, could not fathom why a scientist was wasting time with what looked like an oversized tin can that was supposed to dance across a lake. Even Sir Arthur Harris, the formidable head of Bomber Command, was initially dismissive, viewing Wallis as a distraction from the serious business of carpet-bombing German cities. But Wallis was a man possessed by the logic of his own mathematics. He moved his experiments from small-scale marble catapults in his garden to a massive testing tank at the National Physical Laboratory. He discovered that a simple sphere was too unstable, so he pivoted to a cylindrical shape. Then came the most vital innovation: backspin. By using a motor to spin the 10,000-pound drum backward at 500 revolutions per minute before it was dropped, Wallis found he could create a stabilizing Magnus effect. This backspin would not only help the bomb skip further, but once it hit the dam wall, the spinning motion would cause the cylinder to literally crawl down the face of the dam, staying pinned against the masonry by its own momentum. The engineering was as beautiful as it was terrifying, yet the struggle to have it recognized was a war in itself. Wallis had to fight through layers of skepticism, proving over and over that his calculations were not just theoretical fantasies. He was proposing a mission that required pilots to fly at exactly 60 feet above the water, at a precise speed in total darkness, while a giant spinning drum hung beneath their aircraft. It sounded like suicide, yet Wallis saw it as the only surgical way to bleed the Reich dry. He was a man standing at the intersection of imagination and cold, hard reality, convinced that the greatest strength of the enemy, the massive weight of the water they had harnessed, could be turned into the very instrument of their destruction. Looking back at those frantic months of design and doubt, we see the birth of a new kind of warfare. It was the moment when the brute force of the industrial age began to give way to the precision of the scientific mind. Wallis demonstrated that a single, perfectly placed idea is more powerful than 1,000 aimless salvos. His legacy is etched not just in the breached walls of the Ruhr, but in the realization that innovation often looks like madness until the moment it changes the world. He taught us that when faced with an immovable wall of stone and bureaucracy, the answer is not always to strike harder, but to look at the water, find the right angle, and trust in the physics of the impossible. The bouncing bomb was more than a weapon. It was a testament to the fact that the most fortified positions are often vulnerable to those who are brave enough to rethink the very nature of the elements. It was not just the dams that broke, but the old way of thinking, washed away by the vision of a man who saw a weapon where others only saw a skipping stone. January 14th, 1941, 10 a.m. at the Ministry of Aircraft Production in London. Barnes Wallis stood in a room filled with the smell of stale tobacco and the suffocating weight of tradition, clutching a briefcase that contained the blueprint for a miracle. To the men sitting across from him, decorated officers who had spent decades mastering the art of conventional warfare, Wallis was not a visionary engineer, but a nuisance with a wild imagination. They looked at his diagrams of spherical mines and skipping stones and saw something that belonged in a children's adventure novel, not on the desks of the Air Ministry. The skepticism was not merely a lack of imagination, it was an institutional defense mechanism. The British High Command was a machine built on the logic of heavy ordnance and high-altitude carpet bombing. To suggest that the industrial heart of the Third Reich could be stopped by a spinning drum bouncing across the water was viewed as eccentric madness and technical fantasy. The derision began almost as soon as Wallis finished speaking. One official famously remarked that the idea was tripe of the wildest description. There was a prevailing sense of arrogance among the top brass who believed that if a solution to the Ruhr dams existed, their own traditional scientists would have found it years ago. They pointed to the immense weight of the proposed weapon, nearly 10,000 pounds, and laughed at the notion that any existing bomber could carry such a load while maintaining the precision required for the drop. In their eyes, Wallis was asking for the impossible. He was asking for a specialized aircraft that didn't exist to fly at a suicidal altitude of 60 feet to deliver a weapon that defied the known laws of aerial ballistics. The resistance was led by the gray men of Whitehall, the bureaucrats and mid-level commanders who feared that diverting resources to such a fringe project would weaken the main bombing effort. They saw Wallis as a distraction. At a time when every pound of steel and every gallon of fuel was a precious commodity, the idea of building a spinning, bouncing bomb seemed like a reckless gamble. They mocked the physics of backspin, treating Wallis's detailed calculations as if they were the scribblings of a man who had spent too much time in his garden shed. Even Arthur Harris, the formidable head of Bomber Command, initially dismissed the project with a characteristic bluntness that would have crushed a lesser man. He wanted more planes, more conventional explosives, and more fire. He had no patience for what he called mad scientists and their circus tricks. Wallis found himself fighting a two-front war while the Luftwaffe patrolled the skies over Europe. The corridors of London were patrolled by a rigid adherence to the status quo. For months, his memos were filed away in the back of drawers, and his requests for testing facilities were met with polite but firm rejections. The institution viewed his work through the lens of risk avoidance. If the bomb failed to bounce, the aircraft would be lost for nothing. If the bomb hit the water and sank, it would be a waste of a massive explosive charge. The High Command couldn't grasp that the very thing they mocked, the simplicity of a skipping stone, was the only way to bypass the impenetrable torpedo nets that guarded the Mohne and Eder dams. Yet, as the war dragged on and the traditional bombing raids failed to paralyze German industry, the cracks in the institutional skepticism began to show. Wallis refused to be silenced. He retreated to the water tanks of the National Physical Laboratory, conducting thousands of experiments with small-scale models, proving over and over that the math was sound. Every time he was told it was impossible, he returned with more data, more evidence, and a quiet, burning conviction that the physics of the impossible was Britain's only hope. He was a man fighting against the gravity of history, trying to pull a reluctant military establishment into a future they were too afraid to imagine. The legacy of this struggle remains one of the most poignant lessons of the conflict. It serves as a reminder that the greatest obstacle to victory is often not the strength of the enemy, but the rigidity of one's own mind. The institutional ridicule faced by Barnes Wallis was a symptom of a world that was dying, a world where wars were won by sheer mass and outdated doctrine. When the dams finally broke, it wasn't just a victory of steel and TNT, it was a total vindication of the outsider. The laughter of the high command was silenced by the roar of the water, a sound that echoed through history as the final judgment on those who prioritized tradition over truth. In the skipping stone did what the heaviest bombs could not, proving that when the weight of the world is against you, the only way forward is to change the way the world is seen. The bouncing bomb was a weapon, but the mind that conceived it was the real breakthrough, a testament to the fact that progress is almost always born in the shadow of mockery. January 21st, 1943, at the windswept shoreline of Reculver, Kent. A lone figure stood against the biting North Sea salt, his eyes fixed on a distant speck in the gray sky. Barnes Wallis was a man whose reputation hung by a thread, tethered to a 5-ton cylinder of steel and high explosives that most of the British Air Ministry considered a fool's errand. The project was codenamed Upkeep, but to the skeptical observers from the Royal Air Force, it was simply the professor's toy. The theory was maddeningly simple, yet physically impossible. A bomb that would skip across the water like a flat stone, avoid the underwater torpedo nets of Germany's great dams, and sink to the base of the wall before detonating. But on this morning, the theory was failing. Earlier trials at Chastise Beach in Dorset had been a catalogue of disasters. The initial prototypes, dropped for modified Wellington bombers, did not skip. They disintegrated. Upon hitting the surface at 240 miles per hour, the water did not act like a liquid. It acted like solid granite. The steel casings crumpled like tin foil, singing shards of jagged metal through the air and sinking the hopes of the engineering team into the cold channel depths. Wallis realized that the physics of the bounce were not enough. He needed something to counteract the violent impact, something to give the weapon a will of its own. The solution was as elegant as it was dangerous: backspin. By using a hydraulic motor to spin the drum at 500 revolutions per minute before it was released, Wallis hoped to utilize the Magnus effect. This would not only help the bomb stabilize in flight, but would allow it to literally climb the surface of the water upon impact, skipping with enough velocity to reach the target and then, crucially, hug the face of the dam as it sank. It was a gamble of the highest order. If the spin was too slow, the bomb would dive and explode prematurely. If the plane was too high, the impact would destroy the mechanism. At Reculver, the modified Wellington roared over the waves, flying at a terrifyingly low altitude of just 60 feet. The crew were essentially skimming the whitecaps. Their lives depend on the precision of altimeters that were never designed for such proximity to the Earth. The bomb was released, a dark, spinning blur that dropped toward the sea. The observers held their breath. For a second, there was only the white spray of the impact. Then, a miracle of physics occurred. The cylinder rose from the water, trailing a plume of mist, and leaped 300 feet into the air. It struck the surface again and again and again, clearing 7 distinct skips before settling into the water exactly where a simulated dam wall would have been. Even as the footage was rushed to London, the resistance from high command remained fierce. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, the man they called Bomber Harris, famously dismissed the idea as tripe, viewing Wallis as a distraction from the heavy bombing campaigns that were the RAF's primary focus. But the evidence from the trials at Reculver was undeniable. Wallis had proved that the impossible was merely a problem that had not yet been solved by the right mind. The trials at Chastise Beach and Reculver were not just about testing a weapon. They were about the desperate, frantic race to turn a theoretical concept into a functional tool of war before the window of opportunity closed. The success of these secret trials shifted the momentum of the war effort. It proved that the Mohne, the Eder, and the Sorpe dams were no longer invulnerable fortresses of concrete. They were targets waiting for a precise, violent delivery. The men who flew those trials, risking their lives to drop concrete-filled dummies into the freezing surf, were the silent architects of the coming storm. They navigated the razor-thin margin between aerodynamic failure and historical triumph, proving that the most effective weapons are often born in the moments when traditional logic fails. In the legacy of the trials at Reculver and Chesil Beach extends far beyond the shattered remains of the German dams. It is a reminder that the path to breakthrough is paved with the debris of failed experiments and the echoes of laughter from those too comfortable with the status quo. Wallis and his skipping bombs proved that the gravity of a crisis can force the human mind to rethink the very laws of nature. The water that once seemed like an impenetrable barrier became the very medium of destruction, showing that when a mind is desperate enough and a cause is just enough, even the ocean can be made to step aside for progress. The trials were the quiet prelude to a deafening roar, a testament to the fact that innovation is a lonely road, but it is the only one that leads to the future. March 17, 1943. At the rain-swept airfield of RAF Sampton, Wing Commander Guy Gibson sat across from Air Vice Marshal Ralph Cochrane, the commander of 5 Group. The war had reached a fever pitch, and the mission being proposed was so shrouded in secrecy that even the man tasked with leading it was given only the barest of details. Gibson was a veteran of over 170 sorties, a man whose nerves had been forged in the fires of 100 night raids. Yet even he felt the weight of the impossible request. He was told to form a new squadron, a special unit that would exist for only one purpose: to carry out a single raid of such magnitude that it could alter the course of the entire European conflict. This was the birth of what would become the Legery 617 Squadron, but in those early days, it was simply known as Squadron X. Gibson did not look for recruits among the fresh-faced graduates of flight schools. He went through the logs of Bomber Command, hand-picking the elite, the outliers, and the rebels. He sought out men like Flight Lieutenant Mick Martin, an Australian known for his incredible low-level flying skills, and David Maltby, a pilot who had survived more brushes with death than most could count. These men were brought together under a veil of total silence. They were not told where they were going or what they would be hitting. All they knew was that they were now part of something that demanded every ounce of their skill and every second of their time. They were moved to Sampton, a base cleared of all non-essential personnel. And there, the grueling process of turning the impossible into the routine began. The training was unlike anything ever seen in the history of aerial warfare. To make the bouncing bomb work, the heavy 4-engine Lancaster bombers had to fly at an exact altitude of 60 feet above the water, at night, at a speed of exactly 210 miles per hour. To the average pilot, 60 feet was essentially suicide. A slight tremor of the hand, a momentary lapse in concentration, or a sudden gust of wind would result in a catastrophic impact with the surface of the water. Yet Gibson pushed them. They flew over the reservoirs of the English Midlands, tracing the contours of the landscape, their giant propellers clipping the tops of trees, and their shadows dancing mere inches above the waves. The technical hurdles were staggering. Standard altimeters were notoriously unreliable at such low heights, often fluctuating by dozens of feet. To solve this, a stroke of simple genius was employed. 2 spotlights were mounted on the fuselage, one forward and one aft, angled so their beams would converge on the water's surface exactly 60 feet below the aircraft. The navigator would watch out the window, and when the 2 circles of light touched to form a figure 8, the pilot knew they were at the precise killing height. It was a primitive solution for a high-tech problem, a testament to the ingenuity of men pushed to the brink. As the weeks passed, the physical and mental toll on the crews grew immense. They were flying low-altitude night sorties for hours on, their eyes straining against the darkness, their hearts pounding against their ribs. They were masters of a craft that had no name, flying machines that were never designed to skim the earth like dragonflies. There was a sense of grim destiny hanging over Sampton. They knew they were being sharpened into a blade, and they knew that the blade would eventually be swung against a target of immense importance. The bonds formed in those cramped cockpits were forged in the shadow of almost certain death, a brotherhood of the air that transcended rank or nationality. Looking back from the vantage point of history, the formation of 617 Squadron represents the pinnacle of human spirit under pressure. It was not merely about the machines or the bombs, but about the willingness of individuals to sacrifice their safety for a goal they could barely comprehend. These men were the vanguard of a new kind of warfare, one that relied as much on individual precision as it did on industrial might. Their legacy is not just found in the broken masonry of distant dams, but in the unerring truth that excellence is often found in the most terrifying of circumstances. They proved that when the stakes are high enough, ordinary men can reach for the stars by flying closer to the earth than anyone ever dared. Their story remains a poignant reminder that while the tools of war change, the courage required to use them remains the constant, flickering light that guides us through our darkest hours. May 16, 1943, 9:39 p.m. at RAF Sampton in the heart of Lincolnshire. The silence of the English countryside was shattered by the rhythmic, chest-thumping roar of 76 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. 19 Avro Lancasters of the newly formed 617 Squadron began their long, lumbering taxi toward the runway, their tires groaning under the unprecedented weight of the 9,000-pound Upkeep mines. These were no longer standard bombers. They were specialized instruments of destruction, stripped of their mid-upper turrets and fitted with external calipers to hold the massive drum-shaped bombs that Barnes Wallis had promised could win the war. As Wing Commander Guy Gibson throttled up his lead aircraft, George, he knew that the next few hours would either immortalize his men or erase them from the sky entirely. The mission profile was a pilot's nightmare. To avoid the formidable German radar net that stretched across the occupied coast, the crews were ordered to fly at altitudes that were frankly suicidal. As they crossed the North Sea, the Lancasters descended to just 100 feet above the waves. The moon, though bright, cast deceptive shadows on the shifting water, making depth perception a grueling mental tax. For the crews, the sensation of speed was terrifying. At over 200 miles per hour, the white caps of the waves seemed to whip past the cockpit windows like ghostly fingers. Salt spray clouded the glass, forcing pilots to rely on their instruments and the steady, calm voices of their navigators who were guiding them toward the Dutch coast. Crossing into enemy territory near the island of Leland, the altitude dropped even further. They were now flying at 60 feet. This was not mere low-level flying. This was hedge-hopping in a 4-engine heavy bomber. The pilots had to navigate by sight, following canals, railway lines, and the silver threads of rivers. In the dim light, the silhouettes of trees, church spires, and high-tension power lines loomed out of the darkness with heart-stopping suddenness. Every banking turn carried the risk of a wing tip clipping the earth. Inside the cramped fuselages, the gunners scanned the horizon, their hands tight on the triggers of their Browning machine guns, knowing that at this height, any ground-based rifleman could potentially bring them down. The German response was swift and lethal. As the first wave moved inland, the sky was suddenly crisscrossed by the neon arcs of light-caliber flak. The low-flying Lancasters were sitting ducks for coastal batteries and mobile anti-aircraft units. Flight Lieutenant Bill Estelle, flying B. Baker, was caught in a web of tracer fire and searchlights near Marbach. His aircraft, heavy with fuel and the spinning mine, clipped a line of high-voltage wires and vanished in a spectacular rolling fireball that briefly illuminated the countryside for miles. For the crews flying behind him, there was no time to mourn. They had to push deeper into the heart of the Third Reich, toward the industrial soul of the Ruhr Valley. Maintaining the 60-foot altitude over the water was the most technical challenge of the entire operation. Barometric altimeters were far too imprecise for such a narrow margin of error. The solution was as primitive as it was. Brilliant, 2 spotlights were mounted on the aircraft, one in the nose and one in the belly, angled so their beams would meet on the surface of the water precisely 60 feet below. The navigator would look out the side window and call out corrections down, down, steady until the 2 circles of light merged into a perfect figure 8. It was a dance of light on dark water, performed while flying through a hail of lead and steel. By the time the survivors of the initial crossing reached the approach to the Sorpe, Mohne, and Eder dams, the psychological toll was immense. They had spent hours inches from death, their nervous systems frayed by the constant vibration and the sheer focus required to stay airborne. Yet as the massive granite walls of the dams finally appeared in the distance, bathed in the pale glow of the moon, the fear was replaced by a cold, professional resolve. The bouncing bomb was a theory on paper until this very moment, a ridiculed concept that now rested in the hands of young men who had defied gravity and the German Luftwaffe to reach their target. The legacy of that night transcends the tactical success of the breached walls or the flooded valleys. It resides in the sheer audacity of the human spirit when pushed to the absolute limit. Operation Chastise proved that innovation is often born from the most desperate of circumstances and carried to fruition by those willing to fly where others would not dare to look. The 53 men who did not return from that moonlit mission left behind a story of incredible precision and unimaginable bravery. Their sacrifice was the price of a miracle, a reminder that the path to victory is often paved by those who are willing to skim the very surface of the earth to reach for a higher purpose. They were the Dambusters, and their flight through the darkness remains a guiding light in the annals of military history, proving that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep flying forward, 60 feet at a time until the job is done. Even now, the echoes of those Merlin engines seem to linger over the quiet waters of the Ruhr, a spectral tribute to a generation that gave everything for a glimpse of the dawn. May 17, 1943, 12:28 a.m. At the Mohne reservoir, the night air was thick with the scent of cordite and the deafening rhythmic vibration of 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Guy Gibson circled above in his Lancaster, his eyes fixed on the black expanse of water below. He had already watched 3 of his aircraft release their heavy, spinning cargoes. One mine had overshot the wall, exploding in a harmless geyser of white foam. Another had detonated too early, nearly swatting the low-flying bomber out of the sky with its own shockwave. Now it was David Maltby's turn. His Lancaster, Callsign John Johnny, was a shadow against the moonlit ripples, locked into the perfect altitude of 60 feet by the twin spotlights converging on the surface of the lake. The flak from the dam's towers was a frantic, lethal lace of red tracers, but Maltby did not flinch. When the release lever was pulled, the 5-ton Upkeep mine did not simply fall. It leaped. It danced across the reservoir in 3 massive, gravity-defying skips, shedding speed and spray before striking the center of the massive masonry wall. It sank into the silent, cold pressure of the depths. The explosion that followed was not a sharp crack, but a dull, subterranean roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the German earth. A colossal geyser of white water and mud erupted toward the stars, hanging in the air for what felt like an eternity. As the mist began to settle, the airmen of 617 Squadron leaned out of their perspex blisters, their breath held in their throats. At first, the dam looked intact, a stubborn gray monument in the moonlight. But then, a silver line appeared at the crest. It widened into a crescent, and suddenly, the massive masonry of the Mohne began to crumble like a child's sandcastle. 100 million tons of water found their freedom, roaring through a 100-yard gap with a fury that transformed the valley into a churning graveyard of debris. With the Mohne breached, Gibson led the remaining aircraft toward the Eder. If the first target had been a test of skill, the second was a navigator's nightmare. Tucked deep within a steep, forested valley, the Eder Dam required a terrifying dive over a high ridge, followed by a sharp turn and a desperate climb out to avoid slamming into the cliffs on the far side. Pilot Les Knight sat in the cockpit of Nan, his knuckles white against the control column. The first 2 attempts by his comrades had failed, the mines detonating uselessly against the steep banks of the reservoir. The fog was rolling in, thick and treacherous, masking the target. Knight took his Lancaster down into the throat of the valley, the altimeter spinning wildly, the roar of the engines echoing off the rock walls like a trapped beast. He released the mine at the split second of perfection. It skipped, it struck, and then the Knight turned to fire. The Eder, the largest dam in Germany, shuttered and broke. The success of the mission was a triumph of engineering and raw, unadulterated courage. But the cost of that night began to settle on the crews as they turned their noses toward the English Channel. Of the 19 Lancasters that had departed Southampton, 8 would never return. 53 young men, the elite of Bomber Command, had vanished into the darkness of the Ruhr, their voices silenced forever over the radio waves. Back at the base, Barnes Wallis, the man who had dreamed of skipping stones across the water, sat with his head in his hands. He was devastated by the loss of the crews he had come to love during the grueling months of training. He had wanted to break the back of the German war machine, but he had not fully accounted for the weight of the lives it would take to do so. As the sun rose on May 17th, the scale of the devastation became clear. The Ruhr Valley was a landscape of mud, twisted steel, and ruins. Factories were silenced, coal mines were flooded, and the infrastructure of the Third Reich's industrial heart was shattered. Yet the price was paid not just in airmen, but in the lives of over 1,600 people on the ground. Many of them forced laborers and prisoners of war who were swept away in their sleep by the cold, black torrent. It was a moment of peak technological achievement draped in the somber, heavy robes of human tragedy. The breach of the dams remains one of the most audacious feats in the history of aerial warfare, a testament to what can be achieved when imagination meets iron-willed determination. It proved that no fortress was truly impregnable, and that the very laws of physics could be bent by the steady hand of a skillful pilot. But more than the tactical success, the legacy of the Dambusters is found in the quiet moments of reflection on the staggering cost of victory. It reminds us that behind every headline of a great military triumph, there are empty chairs at the mess table, and silent ripples on the water that never truly go still. The courage of those 60-foot flights lives on, not as a glorification of destruction, but as a profound symbol of the sacrifices made in the darkest hours of the 20th century. They flew into the maw of death to bring a glimmer of hope to a world on fire, leaving behind a story written in stone water. In the uring spirit of those who refuse to believe the impossible cannot be done. Their names are etched in the granite of history, forever flying through the moonlit mist, chasing a dawn they helped to secure for the generations that followed. Even now, when the wind is right over the quiet reservoirs of Germany, one can almost hear the ghostly hum of the merlins, a reminder that the path to peace is often paved by those brave enough to fly where others feared to look. May 17, 1943, 3 a.m. At the Mohne Reservoir, the silence of the Westphalian night was torn asunder, not by the drone of engines, but by the sound of the earth itself cracking open. A gap 75 meters wide and 22 meters deep yawned in the massive dam wall, and a colossal wall of water, an unstoppable inland tsunami, began its terrifying roar down the valley. This was no longer a matter of physics or experimental ballistics. It was the birth of a localized apocalypse. Within minutes, the sleeping towns downstream were engulfed by a torrent carrying thousands of tons of mud, uprooted trees, and the shattered remnants of homes. The Ruhr Valley was the industrial juggernaut of the Third Reich, a dense concentration of coal mines, coke ovens, and steel mills that fed the insatiable hunger of the German war machine. When the Mohne and Eder dams failed, they did not just drown the countryside, they severed the jugular of Nazi industry. Water, the very element required in massive quantities for the production of steel and the cooling of heavy machinery, became a destructive force of nature that the Reich could not contain. Coal mines, the literal bedrock of German energy, were inundated as the floodwaters rushed into the shafts, turning them into vertical tombs and re-ring the fuel for the furnaces unreachable. Without coal, there was no coke. Without coke, the blast furnaces of the Ruhr went cold. Bridges were swept away like toothpicks, severing the railway arteries that transported finished tanks and artillery to the crumbling fronts in the east. The electrical grid, powered by the hydroelectric stations that had stood at the foot of those very dams, flickered and died across vast swaths of the region, plunging the heart of the German economy into a literal and figurative darkness. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, would later recount the sheer panic that gripped the Nazi leadership in the hours following the breach. He flew over the valley the following morning and saw a landscape transformed into an alien, muddy wasteland where the precision of German engineering had been replaced by the chaos of the deep. For a brief, critical moment, the industrial output of the Ruhr dropped to a staggering degree, threatening to derail the logistics of the entire summer offensive. Yet the aftermath was as much about the German capacity for desperate reconstruction as it was about British ingenuity. Speer mobilized thousands of workers from the organization taut, pulling men away from the construction of the Atlantic Wall to repair the breaches with a frantic, obsessive speed. The dams were rebuilt before the autumn rains could arrive, but the cost was not just measured in concrete and stone. The diversion of resources, manpower, and focus was a strategic victory in itself, forcing the Reich to prioritize its internal survival over its outward conquests. We must also look at the dark shadow of this success, for the waters did not distinguish between the architects of war and the victims of it. Thousands perished in the surge, many of them forced laborers from the Soviet Union and occupied territories, trapped in their barracks as the tide rose. Their lives were the hidden collateral of a strategy designed to break a nation's will by breaking its machines. It was a stark reminder that in total war, the line between industrial target and human tragedy is often washed away by the same current. The legacy of the Dambusters raid lies in the uneasy tension between the brilliance of Barnes Wallis's invention and the grim reality of its execution. It proved to a skeptical world that no fortress was truly impregnable, and no resource was safe from a determined enemy. It forced the German High Command to realize that their industrial heartland was no longer a sanctuary, but a front line. Today, the reservoirs are calm once again, their surfaces reflecting the peaceful sky of a different century. But beneath that quiet water lies the memory of a night when gravity and liquid were weaponized to change the course of history. The raid remains a testament to the belief that the impossible is merely a challenge waiting for the right mind to solve it. It is a story of high stakes and higher courage, but also of the profound responsibility that comes with the mastery of destruction. As we look back at the jagged ruins and the eventual restoration of the Ruhr, we see the uring spirit of innovation tempered by the heavy toll of its application. The echoes of that night still ripple through time, reminding us that while technology may provide the means to win a war, it is the human cost that defines the weight of the victory. The ghosts of the Merlin engines have long faded, but the lesson remains that in the crucible of conflict, the most powerful weapon is the relentless will to turn the tide against tyranny, no matter the height of the wall or the depth of the water. May 17th, 1943, 6 a.m. at RAF Sampton. The sun begins to pull away the thick shroud of mist from the Lincolnshire airfield, but the silence that greets the dawn is heavy and hollow. Of the 19 Lancasters that roared into the night sky just hours earlier, only 11 have returned. 8 empty dispersal bays stand as jagged teeth in the squadron's line, and 53 men, the elite of the elite, are missing. In the officers' mess, breakfast is served to half-empty tables where the steam from the tea rises into a room where no one speaks. This was the immediate, visceral price of Operation Chastise, the morning after the bouncing bomb had finally done what the British High Command had deemed a scientific impossibility. The legacy of the Dambusters is often framed through the lens of Barnes Wallis's sheer brilliance. He was a man who saw the physical world not as a set of constraints, but as a series of mathematical problems to be solved with a pencil, a slide rule, and a tireless devotion to logic. The bouncing bomb, or Upkeep, was not just a weapon, it was a defiance of the established laws of conventional warfare. It was a testament to the fact that when pushed to the absolute brink of national survival, the human mind is capable of extraordinary, gravity-defying leaps. But Wallis himself would spend much of his remaining life haunted by the outcome. When he eventually learned of the staggering casualty rates among his boys, he famously broke down in tears. He had provided the key to unlock the dams, but he had also unlocked a gate to a level of destruction that weighed heavily on his conscience until his final breath. He realized, perhaps better than anyone, that the beauty of a scientific breakthrough is often marred by the blood it is destined to spill. We cannot speak of the genius without speaking of the blood. The crews of the 617 Squadron were not just pilots. They were specialists, many of them in their early 20s, asked to fly a 4-engine heavy bomber at 60 feet above the water. This was an altitude lower than the height of the very dams they were attacking, a feat of airmanship that bordered on the suicidal. To fly through walls of flak at such speeds and heights required a brand of courage that remains incomprehensible to the modern mind. Yet, the cost was not confined to the RAF. Below the breached walls of the Mohne and Eder dams, the valley became a watery graveyard. Over 1,600 people were swept away by the inland tsunamis that surged through the Ruhr. Many were German civilians, but more than half were forced laborers from the Soviet Union and other occupied territories, trapped in their barracks as the Blackwater rushed in. In our modern historical reflection, the Dambusters raid sits at a difficult, painful intersection of military necessity and profound human tragedy. It was a victory measured in the destruction of infrastructure, but its ledger is written in the names of the drowned. Historians have long debated the strategic efficacy of the raid. The dams were repaired within months, and the industrial output of the Ruhr was hampered, but not entirely halted. However, to judge the mission solely on coal production or steel tonnage is to miss its greatest psychological impact. In the dark years of 1943, when the prospect of victory still felt distant and the price of the air war was climbing to unsustainable heights, Operation Chastise was a thunderclap. It proved to the German High Command that nowhere was safe, and that British ingenuity could reach into the very heart of the Reich. It gave the Allied public a leg to rally around when they needed it most. The myth of the Dambusters has since transcended the cold facts of the historical record. It has become a cornerstone of identity, immortalized by the soaring melodies of the Dambusters March and the flickering black and white images of the silver screen. We remember the spinning drum and the low-level flight, but as the decades pass, the legacy evolves. We now see the raid as a precursor to the age of precision munitions, a moment where the blunt instrument of area bombing was briefly replaced by a surgeon's scalpel. In the story of the bouncing bomb is a story of the human condition in extremis. It is a reminder that war demands the impossible and then charges an unthinkable price for its delivery. We look back at the dark waters of the Ruhr, not just to admire the engineering or the bravery, but to remember the fragility of life caught in the gears of total war. The ripples from those breached dams have finally stilled, but the reflection they leave behind remains clear. The greatest triumphs are forever shadowed by the deepest sorrows, and the path to peace is often paved by those willing to fly into the mouth of the storm for a cause they believed was greater than themselves.